Hi, everyone. Good evening. No matter where you are, it's evening, 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the evening. I have Brian and Jan here with me. You guys may have seen Jan's last webinar with us last week, I believe it was. We had some great feedback on that webinar, and we wanted to bring Jan back to talk about another subject, a little more controversial subject, but something that people in the assisted living industry deal with every single day. So he is our president of the association. Many of you may know him. You may have even used his services that he provides to our members. So he's going to be talking with Jan today, just as you see us here. There won't be any presentation. And if you look on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a drop-down that says questions. If at any point in time you want to add a comment, you want to ask a question, go ahead and type it in there, and I will prompt Jan and Brian to answer. So I'm going to hand it over to Jan and Brian, and we'll get started here.
That's great. All right, thank you, Molly. So this webinar comes about because Jan and I had a conversation a couple months ago where I was asking her to be part of our board of advisors for the National Association. And just in the course of getting to know each other, we had a conversation about what we'd each been observing with respect to emergency response reactions to assisted living and coming to help people with falls and a variety of other things. And from that conversation, Jan had the most amazing insights, as well as some data available and comments that have caused me to think that we should probably talk about this as a community to see if there's a need to not have any kind of a fight with the emergency responders, but look at a way to evolve what they do to match what the needs of the community are. And from that standpoint, one of the first things that Jan shared with me was some information about what kind of things are being asked of emergency responders in general. Jan, would you like to take that up?
Yeah, so let me preface this to say that one of the hats that I have the privilege of wearing is leading a dementia fellowship. So we have, and that's through an organization in Phoenix called Hospice of the Valley, and they endowed money so that we could develop leaders in various organizations to improve dementia care across the spectrum. And over the past 3 years, each year, interestingly, I have had someone from a fire department. First 2 years, somebody from Phoenix Fire, and then someone with Tempe Fire and Mesa Fire. And so through that, their focus is how do they improve their members, meaning fellow firefighters' ability to better respond to people with dementia and do it in a thoughtful, informed, and respectable way. And so through that, I've had the opportunity to learn more about the EMS services and some of the challenges that they encounter in their daily lives. And I think one thing of note that was interesting to me that I had not given a great deal of thought of is that the type of service they deliver now is very different than in the past. So when you think about why we had fire departments come about, is because we had buildings and homes that weren't built to the specifications they are now, and so they were hired to do what it sounds like, put out fires. And then we developed this 911 system, and they will tell you that to their credit or discredit, there's been such a great focus on teaching us as public people to respond to 911, that the system, in fact, in many ways is overused and not really intended to respond the way the calls have come. And so really less than 10–15% of the work that fire departments do is relative to responding to fires. And then another percentage is really responding to a true emergency, if you will, being, heart attack, stroke, motor vehicle accidents, those kind of traumatic sorts of things. And so almost 85% now of their calls are for people who are falling and can't get up, and for a lot of behavioral disorders, mental health kinds of things that are popping up. So as you can imagine, here we have a group of people who we've trained to fight fires and do advanced life support, and they're not doing that. And so you can see that there's this disconnect between, well, wait a minute, hasn't your your curriculum shifted in a way to address kind of the mental health, and I'll put dementia kind of in that term. And many of the folks who reside in residential care, right, the bulk of them will have some sort of cognitive disorder. So making their call be very different than what typically happens when they're getting out their fire hoses or they're scraping somebody off the freeway, or, you know, some of the very challenging things that they do. So I found that interesting in that as our systems have evolved in many ways, and I don't want to target and say that what they do is unimportant. It is important. Certainly when we need a true emergent call, it's nice that they show up within a matter of minutes, or if our house is on fire. But these other things then bring to light that in many ways a new model in my mind needs to be crafted to think about how do we respond to the less emergent situation. And in this case, you know, older, frail adults who need attention, maybe not most immediately, but need attention, and need it done with dignity and compassion.
Right. So in some ways, what we're seeing is that the needs of these people who've been trained to deal with significant emergencies has actually shifted. And so that approximately 80% of what they're called to do is really dealing with elderly adults who have fallen or had some other kind of problem, and that are not these traditional, somewhat more dramatic emergencies that they've been trained for. So there's a bit of a disconnect, a couple of disconnects between what they're trained to do and what the community needs. And so maybe some sort of rebalancing about what it is that they are being asked to do or being budgeted to do and expected to do. Maybe some kind of conversation like that needs to happen so that they are relevant to community needs.
Yeah, I know. I live in the city of Tempe, and so a part of that, I've been involved in the dementia-friendly community movement. So we've really been trying to raise the bar for citizens living in Tempe who are affected, so that they could have more dignified approach to community life, if you will. So through that, I've been quite involved with the Tempe Police and Tempe Fire, not only educating officers and first responders, but learning how the city is responding. So for example, they've been more innovative and have received and gone after grant funding, where they have what they call a patient advocate service. So this is really run by a nurse and a part-time nurse practitioner who go out to locations where they're often getting frequent 911 calls that would not necessarily be emergent, but clearly it's more of a social need that often is being determined, and trying to figure out the problem solve, how do we contend with that. Likewise, I know the nurse we have this year from Mesa Fire, for example, her focus is really particularly working with residential settings, and how is it that fire can work more collaboratively with residential settings so that they could reduce potentially the number of unnecessary calls that they feel are unnecessary. So I think that sort of dialogue in problem solving is very much needed. Is trying to understand what is the need, why does one party see it as less important, if you will, than another, and how do we come to some potential resolutions? You know, are there some trainings we can do? Is there another model of care? For example, I just spoke to a colleague of mine with Phoenix Fire. He's a former captain with Phoenix Fire, and he was very involved in many of the advocacy efforts, particularly with senior living, with the same goal that we have, is to provide safe senior care. And I said to him, you know, I'm curious with all of the, you know, in this greater Phoenix area, I think we have over 1,500 residential settings for older adults and intellectually, you know, developmentally impaired adults, et cetera. And I said, you know, I'm curious, since you do a lot of non-emergent, if you will, responses to people who have fallen, have you ever thought, rather than bringing out the big truck with 4 hulking guys with all, you know, that are gas guzzlers, why not like a smaller van with 2 EMTs, right, who could respond, especially I think about residential homes where there might only be one person on staff. Let's say it's at night, and one person can't get somebody up right, from a fall? And could a couple EMTs respond in a more cost-effective way and do a, a once-over, assessing that it looks like this is a person who doesn't need to go to the emergency room. Although, or does, or that maybe we do need to call in the truck and the boys to do a bit more assessment, because sometimes we don't know really with frail elders. There could be a fracture that's not seen, but to our best estimate. And I think one of the concerns is, is we're talking about a governmental response, right? It's not nearly as fluid as what your membership is, right? You are entrepreneurs who have found ways to provide excellent care in a home-based setting for, adults, older adults. And so you're very fluid in how you do business and how you craft new ways to, meet a solution. And here, I think the response is, well, how are we going to pay for it? We can't do that. And so I think, in many ways, this is where I see, the system is stuck. And so, of course, I get off the phone with him and I think, gee, how could we do a small grant to buy a van and pay for a couple EMTs for the course of a year and evaluate cost effectiveness, in terms of how much gas is saved and do we have a better response and what is customer satisfaction like, both for, our residential settings as well as for the personnel who are involved in this.
Well, it's interesting. I assume that you've heard these comments such as use of gas and other kinds of government budgetary kinds of concerns, but it's not. This is not a recent thing. This
right,
evolution has been underway for at least 30 years, and what we're seeing is you shared with me the numbers from Arizona about police calls, and it's overwhelmingly senior adults, senior adults, and very little, relatively speaking, emergent care. So it's these people are taxpayers. They have been taxpayers for their whole lives, 60 years and plus, and they deserve the same kind of care whether they're in a large facility or small facility, same kind of response as any other taxpayer. And now fire trucks don't hesitate to go to an individual resident's home if somebody calls 911, but they kind of bristle a little bit when it comes to going to some place where there's a commercial aspect to it, and I can kind of understand that. And so, how do you propose that we have a communication which can harmonize those two ideas between commercial demand, commercial obligations, and government obligations?
Yeah, so it's almost like we need a mediator to come in and between the two groups who can really help articulate and find the common ground, because I do think there's more common ground than less common ground. I see on both sides of these paradigms, if you will, that at the end of the day, we want to deliver a good service, and we want the people we care for to be safe and comfortable. And we see the same thing, from our first responders. I think just the method and understanding of how to get there have gotten lost in the emotion, of this. Perhaps we need more women firefighters too, who could soften this. I wonder how much of this is we've got a lot of testosterone running here with the men who don't mince words too sometimes at these meetings, which is really, really unfortunate. So I think understanding what is it they need from us, what do we need from them, are really become important things. So I know from fire, I often hear one of the frustrations that they encounter is when they do respond, let's say to a 911 call, and this is not a person who needs to get up from a fall, but there's been called an emergent issue. One of the challenges that they've reported is that often they will show up and there's no one there to give them report, right? So they're wanting to find out, who called, what's in, and one of the challenge, and this would be more in the larger residential settings than in our residential homes, is that sometimes it'll be an individual caregiver who will call 911 from their own personal cell phone, and then they'll leave the situation and here come fire, and as you can imagine, they're looking to get a quick history so they can make decisions on what needs to be done and do they need to transport the person or not. and poof, everyone disappears or no one knows who called. And now we have a resident, right, who can't give an accurate history as to what's wrong. So they're left in a quandary. And I think that's quite frustrating. So I think one of the things is, how do we organize a response, right? To, if we've called them, how is it we're clear to them, this is what we need from you, or this is what has transpired, because otherwise, we wouldn't be calling. What we need from them is respect and dignity, right? We need to be treated just the way they would treat a family member. You're right, when they're going into a personal residence, right? I would be very put off if I called 911 for myself or a family member and they came in with attitude, right? Like I was somehow a bother to them. And I think that's often the appearance that they can have to our residential staff. And I know, speaking to residential staff, they're threatened by these folks. They're largely big, I'm 5'10". I mean, so I'm a tall woman. They intimidate me. They come in and, with their big bags, and they want it, and they want it now. It can be intimidating and off-putting, particularly for, our typical caregiver who doesn't have an extensive background, in the medical field to feel even competent. So I could see where one could feel really quite intimidated by that. And so we need from them the same sort of patience that I see them provide to family caregivers, and the time that they need, and showing the same sort of compassion that they would show to us in a residential setting.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure, as you've said, that there's a few things that they would like people in the residential assisted living business, residential care homes, they would like them to have a certain level of responsibility for understanding how this response works. So somebody needs to be there, whoever called needs to be there, whether it's a person who used their personal cell phone or not. It needs to give them the best information that they can so that they can assess the situation. Now, of course, if they come in there like the house is on fire, then that is going to be intimidating to a lot of caregivers in the middle of the night. And so there's got to be probably some education on both sides about what is needed in order to make things more practical in terms of what the response should be. And I'm still stuck at the first part, which is that, well, if 88% or so of the response that is called for is for dealing with seniors, then we need a bit of a shift. And then they need to work with the community to figure out how to communicate to the community what they need to hear from us.
It brings up an interesting subject. It makes me think about what Jan said, where you bring in a whole almost department to deal with this. If this is truly statistically significant, right, across the board, across the United States, we're seeing the same numbers, 80% of the calls, things like that, then it should be enough that they would want to designate special resources just for this, right?
It seems like it. It might be that there's some historical thinking, institutional thinking that needs a bit of a shift, and maybe that can happen with a conversation. Because if we just look at in terms of them being available for emergency response budgets are enormous in many cities. But if you look at what's really needed in terms of emergency response, maybe they don't need all that, except on the periodic occasion. So an alignment of needs with what the community wants is important.
Yeah, I know they certainly have. They're pulled in multiple directions as well. I know, for example, the opioid, epidemic that has been going on has really been quite significant, as well as the number of weapons that they're encountering now. So there's, I also do want to relate that there's a heightened real sense of fear for their own safety and well-being. And in fact, when I spoke with my colleague the other day about concerns, even we were talking about COVID, and I was asking him, kind of what's your take on our state not disclosing to the public which communities, senior communities are affected with COVID. And I've been kind of on the side that, well, I feel like here the senior industry is going to get a black eye again. There's this assumption if there's COVID in the building, somehow we've been negligent in doing our duties. And he said, here's what's happening on his end, that, they've got teams responding to emergencies in these communities, and they don't know when they're walking in if there's going to be COVID. And then he says, and then we walk in and here the staff don't really have the PPE that they need to protect themselves, let alone protect other residents. So, the amount of other external things that are happening, I think we also need to understand. Sometimes these crews are responding to 30 calls in the course of a 24-hour period. So there is no downtime, and many of these calls are really quite emotional. So I'll tell you, one day I was doing some dementia training with Tempe Fire when a crew came in for training, and they had just come from a pediatric near drowning, and they were rattled, and understandably so. I could see the lack of focus, and I was thinking, gee, this must be really tough to go from call to call to call if they have no time to kind of reset, because I'm asking them, who on your crew can reset their emotions to put on a happy face to now walk into a residential or home setting where we have a person who is living with dementia who is becoming aggressive or is paranoid and delusional, right? Who's going to talk them down? Because I'll tell you how you're going to go in and what you're going to look like, and what you're going to do is piss them off, excuse my French, but I want to be harsh, to say you're going to add to this behavioral disturbance because you haven't managed your own emotional baggage that you're bringing with you. And so again, I temper that with how is it we, again, respectfully have these discussions, because I also appreciate they're doing work I would never want to do. And yet we need them to somehow reset and come into our place of business, if you will, and be able to assist us so that they can assist the resident we care about to get the appropriate care they need. And I think at the end of the day, they want that, but I think they can lose that in the course of the stress of the day. And again, I'm not wanting to make apologies for them, but I think it's something for us to keep in mind as we work with these folks. And likewise, line of duty. These shifts can be very long as a caregiver, right? I mean, there are days that, quite honestly, I've gone home and I thought I could just tear my hair out, right? It's been a very stressful day. So I also want to respect the work that our caregivers do, trying their best effort when sometimes the whole house is just in chaos, right? It happens despite our best efforts.
That makes a lot of sense. And well, you've had a few conversations, you say, with Tempe Fire and a few other kind of folks. Do you have any idea, or even from people who are listening in, any suggestions about how we might begin a conversation about this?
Well, one of my, so the nurse colleague I'm now working with in Mesa, I love the approach that she's taking. So she's in a zip code that there are lots and lots of senior residential communities. So most of the calls they go on are relative to seniors. And so, of course, she responds to many of the negative calls that they get from residential settings in terms of they weren't happy with the crew and how they showed up and what they did. And she's there to problem solve, right? Which I really appreciate. She's a nurse. She is a nurse with Mesa EMS and Fire, and so her job is to really serve as the liaison and understand what is happening, how can we improve our service. And so she's working with this. The proposal is to work with this residential setting to understand how is it we could do it better. Let's kind of walk through the types of calls that are coming in, and how is it we find that middle ground of what is it we need from you? What do you need from us? How could we better respond? Or if there's this push, and this would be in a community where there would probably be 2 or 3 caregivers, let's say we have a fall resulting in a non-injury from our best, a guess, if you will, because again, some people fracture and then fall, so I'm also aware of that. But is there a possibility perhaps that fire instruct caregiver staff on how do you help someone get up from a fall? Would that be helpful? Is the community receptive? How do their leaders or owners feel about that? Are there liability issues that we're concerned about? So I think that becomes a really nice model that she's looking at. She hopes that if it's successful in one community, that she can then take this to other communities in that same area and introduce, here's kind of what we've done to provide greater success and better patient care on both of our ends, because that's what they're really looking at as a win-win.
Right. I can tell you that in some states, they have passed legislation which shifts that obligation onto the residential care homes to help people with falls, to make some sort of a preliminary assessment, which is, of course, a bit of a challenge since for assisted living in particular, it's supposed to be non-medical and they're not really qualified to make those
They're
kinds
not.
of,
They're not.
they're kind of assessments. And so there are also some insurance related issues that have yet to come up. But that would actually be a good conversation to have that included some emergency responders, some health departments, as well as some insurance representatives to look at how all this might fall together. Because part of the reason that assisted living wasn't picking up homes to begin with was because it wasn't covered by their insurance.
Right.
And so these things are not disconnected.
Right, and I think in my original training, I go back to the day in geriatrics. One of the things I learned very early in my profession, I worked with a physical therapist, and that is, how do I teach the caregiver at home, in this case, a residential setting, to help the frequent faller to get up following a fall? And so I think sometimes we've gotten away from that. In fact, I was just on a webinar the other day with Dr. Ken Dykewald. He's the gentleman who wrote the book Age Weight, right? And he and I have been at this for a gazillion years, and I was listening to his frustration. And I think we're seeing it evidenced here in this discussion that we've known that we are an aging nation. We are an aging world. And what we've been doing is actually taking resources away from aging services and the professions, if you will. So it's very hard to find a geriatrician. Most people go, what the heck is a geriatrician? And they can't afford to practice given how we reimburse them or don't reimburse them. So we've seen that we don't nearly have the geriatric know-how, right, within our workforce that is absolutely required. And so now we're paying the piper, and rather than looking at solutions, we're busy pointing fingers, which is not helpful. So I'm in the business of how do we stop pointing and how do we work together to find amenable solutions. And I know that's really what's wanted here as well.
That'd be interesting if we could find a way to put together that some sort of a conversation, even if that conversation is merely how can we go about having a bigger conversation. So perhaps that would be something to explore with your colleague at Mesa Emergency Response.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. We've definitely got very interested people in this, I would say, that really have their hearts in the right place and want to do the right thing. And I will say, unfortunately, a lot of the issues that I've seen around fire, because I'll ask them, how many of these places are you responding to repeatedly? So like the person who wanders away from the residential setting, and I don't care what type of setting it is, if you're returning them 20 times in the course of, a month, I would say that's negligent care. Right? So is this widespread, or is it more stratified to it? And they'll admit that's probably 10% of care is bad, and the other 90% is really good. And so I think then they get frustrated and stuck on the bad 10 versus focusing on the good 90. And how do we take those practices or get government to shut those 10% down, right? That are really clearly not providing a standard of care that's safe for whatever the residents' needs are.
Right, that's right. Molly, has anybody chimed in with a question or comment that they would like to participate on this issue in general, or specifically the question about how to get this conversation started, or whether we even should? Not yet?
No, I think that's a great question we could ask people to chime in on now. If anyone has any experience with this or has something that they feel could contribute to this conversation, absolutely, I would write in now. But I was just looking up while we were speaking of devices that could be sold to these homes or brought in as mandatory, you know, things that could be in the home that could help somebody stand up from a fall. And there's a couple of them out there, but they're very expensive. Over $5,000 for a device that just lays on the ground and, you know, has a hydraulic system to lift them up. It's very interesting to me that there hasn't been a more reasonable solution for this for a care home, right?
Well, they're probably not quite there with development of the technology to the point that it can be inexpensive. And secondly, there's probably not a lot of motivation right now to make it real cheaper, since they know it's an important issue. And it is an important issue. We've got, you know, some 110-pound caregiver trying to handle somebody who could be 200 pounds or more, and even two of them are going to struggle. So it's an issue that.
Well, and even somebody who's 100 pounds, when they're fully dependent on the floor, I will tell you, it is extremely challenging to get them up. And then you worry about low back injuries. I mean, there's been a lot in the nursing literature about nursing safety and backs. I mean, you rarely see a nurse who can go 25 years working at the bedside because their backs literally give out. And we're talking about beds that lower and rise, and it's literally backbreaking. I think the other thing we're seeing is a reflection of how we have really shifted in this industry. So those lift devices, if you will, were created for people who lived in skilled nursing care, because back in the day, that's the level of care they got, and they were reimbursed for that. Well, nobody wants to live in a skilled nursing facility any longer. I mean, it's a dinosaur of an industry. I mean, and they're now more transitional care settings. So again, we have pushed the acuity of this and the dependency of these residents like we've never seen in the past. So I think back in my 40-year nursing career, how I've seen such a shift in people who now have become dependent on these technologies, right? And these lift devices, thankfully they're there, but we haven't necessarily created an industry where that has shifted with them, and there's reimbursement to make it happen. So, it's very payment driven too. I think when you look at our country and how we deliver care and how we kind of license or de-license things. So again, it's part of this aging of a nation that we haven't really been smart and thinking through and really understanding the changing nature and needs of the types of people that we're taking care of that it goes well beyond dementia.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Molly, I don't see any questions coming in. Do you right now?
No questions just yet. I think everyone is absorbing all of this information, and I don't think this will be the last time we have this conversation. No. It sounds like this is going to be something we could really build on.
I'm sure that's Will. I'm going to definitely reach out again, Jan, and let's talk about trying to stimulate a brainstorming conversation with some of your counterparts there in Arizona. In the meantime, though, before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like to say to Jan before I end this off?
No, I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. I think the work that we're doing is so important. And the customers that we serve are hidden voices still within our nation. And if we're not advocating for what good care looks like, who's going to do that? And I like this idea that we can come to some solutions with, our EMS professionals as well. I do believe, I'm not a Pollyanna necessarily, but maybe I am. But I do like to believe in the good of people, especially those who choose helping professions, that we can find our common ground and find solutions to challenging situations.
Absolutely. Well, the helping professions have been on the forefront for the last couple of months. I am happy to say that it looks like the smaller assisted living residences, which are primarily our membership, have been spared a lot of the impact that the larger facilities have, in part because they're small and don't have as much foot traffic in and out of the building. And so our members have been quite fortunate, and they're very happy about that and and are also doing quite a good job. They're taking this seriously.
Yeah.
They're taking this quite seriously. So with that, I think Jan and I are done. Molly?
Yeah, we do have a couple of people that have chimed in. Armando asks if you have a list of books or resources on this topic, or some books that you could suggest to people. Maybe you could email them in to me and I'll send them out to the list afterwards.
Yeah, no, I don't know, but I'd be happy. I'm kind of a bit of a nerd and love to do literature reviews. So, I'd be happy to see what I can find in PubMed, which is the national database. And so maybe Molly, let me take a look in the next few days and see what I can find.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe a book needs
We
to
have
be
another.
written.
Yeah, right. Here you go. Here's a book idea, Jan.
I just finished one. I'm still trying to push it out.
Well, this comment's talking about your book. Rosie chimed in and said she wanted to say that your book about traveling well with dementia was great. And she wanted to know if either you or Brian had any feedback or input on the bill that we recently saw here in Arizona, HB 2260, which was initiated by firefighter, which is in the third read status.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons I called my colleague to get the skinny on it. And, he said, unfortunately, this was his take on it, that, the parties had come together and there was a lot of really great discussion and agreement. And then a lobbyist somehow got pulled in. And the lobbyists kind of took it and ran with it and slated it one way and really created some animosity. And so I think it's unfortunate that things were not articulated the way that the committee had been working on. And, he was saying, hey, I think we need to get a mediator in on this to, really, let's keep the legislators out of this. Let's keep these, the politicians and lobbyists who really only have a certain interest at heart, and how do we get back to really our common ground? And I think that's, so I think definitely it did not work to what the original kind of ideals were, is really my takeaway.
All right, well, we'll have a separate conversation offline about who was paying for that particular lobbyist that, that messed things up between what sounds like was a productive conversation, but that's not for here. Anything else, Molly?
Right.
It looks like that's it so far. And that was a wonderful conversation. I think this is just opening a door to what people have been dealing with in the senior care industry over the past, 10, 20 years probably.
All right, go ahead and close this down.
All right, everyone, have a great evening. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Our next webinar is May 6th. So if anybody is wanting to know when our next one is, it's with Jack York, and it's never too late.
Awesome.
So you guys have a great weekend, and we're going to melt here in Arizona. It's over 100 degrees.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.